She doesn't belong in this family.
His mother humiliated me in front of everyone, and when he stayed silent, I ended the marriage. I'm Emily Carter. I've spent years planning weddings and seeing how money quietly decides who holds the power afterward. If these stories resonate with you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what unfolds next. And if you're already here, let me know where you're watching from. Now, let's begin.
She's standing in the middle of the reception. White dress, lights blazing, guests frozen in place. Her mother-in-law is pointing straight at her, voice sharp enough to cut the room, making it clear she doesn't belong, and the groom is right there. Saying nothing, the shock isn't the accusation, it's what comes after it. No one steps in, no one interrupts, no one even looks surprised. Because the real violence in this room isn't noise, it's permission. A line has been crossed, and everyone has silently agreed to let it stand. First, someone oversteps, then it's dismissed as family tension. Then the silence starts to cost something. And finally, the bride realizes the truth that changes everything. Waiting to be protected has already cost her her place, her dignity, and her future. This isn't just a story about a wedding going wrong. It's about a pattern, about what silence does to power, to relationships, to identity. Because if this level of silence is accepted on her wedding day, what kind of life can exist after it? I was standing near the edge of the reception hall when I realized this wedding had already broken. Even though no one had said it out loud yet, crystal chandeliers hung low over the ballroom, throwing warm light onto polished marble floors. Waiters moved in rehearsed lines, adjusting linen folds, refilling glasses that were barely touched. Everything looked expensive in the way money tries to look effortless. But effort always leaves fingerprints, doesn't it? You can polish a room endlessly and still feel the tension vibrating through it like a wire pulled too tight. Eleanor stood near the center of it all, smiling with a precision that only comes from discipline, not joy. Her gown fit her perfectly, ivory lace off the shoulder, elegant without begging for attention. The kind of dress that assumes respect instead of demanding it. And yet, the way her fingers kept worrying, the edge of her napkin told a different story. Who notices that except someone trained to watch for cracks? And why was I already bracing myself? I want you to understand something right away. When a wedding goes wrong, it rarely starts with shouting. It starts with permission. Quiet, socially acceptable permission. Margaret Hawthorne had been circulating since the moment guests entered the hall. Not hosting, controlling. Straightening floral arrangements that had already been approved. Whispering to the band about tempo, correcting staff who hadn't made a single mistake. Her sequined gown caught the light every time she turned, and she turned often, making sure she was seen. Power doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it just never leaves the room. Harrison, meanwhile, stayed close to her side. Too close. His tuxedo was immaculate, boutonniere pinned just right, but his posture leaned subtly toward his mother, not his wife. When Margaret spoke, he listened. When Eleanor spoke, he smiled. The kind of smile meant to soften, not support. I watched that exchange more than once and felt my stomach tighten. How often do we mistake calm for stability? From the outside, this was a flawless Aspen wedding. Historic church followed by a reception so refined it felt curated for photographs instead of people, influential guests. Quiet admiration, but beneath that polish, Eleanor wasn't being treated like the bride. She was being treated like a guest who might overstay her welcome. I've learned over the years to reframe moments like this, especially for the couples who can't see them yet. What looks like help is often just control wearing a polite mask. And what feels uncomfortable now usually becomes unbearable later. The problem doesn't begin on the wedding day, it just finally stops hiding. The first comment landed softly, almost playfully. Margaret leaned toward Eleanor, while a small group of guests stood nearby and said something about the seating arrangement being a bit ambitious. She laughed as she said it. Eleanor laughed too, a fraction of a second later. That delay mattered. It always does. Was it a joke? Or was it a correction disguised as charm? Moments later, Another remark, this time about the music choice. Then the menu, each one delivered with a smile sharp enough to cut. Eleanor nodded, adjusted, apologized for things that weren't mistakes. Harrison stood there, hands folded, eyes down for just a second too long. I remember thinking, how many times does someone have to be diminished before it becomes visible to everyone else? Here's what I want you to notice, and this is important. Disrespect doesn't test social limits first. It tests emotional ones. And once it finds no resistance, it organizes itself. By the time dinner was served, Margaret had stopped pretending her comments were casual. She corrected Eleanor openly now, in front of guests, in front of staff. She questioned decisions as if they were moral failures, not preferences. Eleanor's shoulders stayed straight, her voice calm, but something in her gaze shifted. The expectation she had carried into that room, that she would be protected, partnered, chosen, began to erode. Money played its quiet role too, not spoken directly, but always implied. Who paid for what? Who made this possible? Wealth sat in the room like a weight on Eleanor's chest, tilting every interaction out of balance. Financial generosity can be a gift or a leash, and this one was pulled tight. I watched Eleanor look at Harrison then, not accusing, not angry, just searching. Isn't that the moment that breaks people, when you look for backup and find polite absence instead? He murmured something about keeping the peace, about not causing a scene, and I saw it land. The realization that no one was going to stop this. When Margaret finally said it, that Eleanor wasn't truly worthy of her son, the room didn't explode. It froze. Conversations stalled. Glasses paused mid-air, and Eleanor understood something with devastating clarity. This wasn't accidental. This was intentional exposure. I've seen conflict escalate, but I've also seen the exact second someone knows there's no way back. Eleanor's expression didn't shatter, it settled. Like a door closing quietly, but permanently. And standing there, watching her absorb that truth, I thought, how far does humiliation have to go before leaving becomes the only form of self-respect left? I've learned that once a room shifts against someone, it does so quietly at first. Not with gasps or outrage, but with subtle recalibrations, chairs angling away, conversations lowering eyes, deciding where not to land. That's what happened next. The reception didn't stop. It adjusted, and Eleanor was no longer centered inside it. Dinner plates arrived with military precision, porcelain against linen, silverware aligned like rules no one planned to break. A string quartet played something light, almost cheerful, the kind of music meant to smooth over discomfort. Isn't it strange how elegance can become camouflage? How beauty can be used to deny what everyone is feeling? Margaret took her seat as if nothing had occurred, posture relaxed, chin lifted. She spoke easily with the guests nearest her, laughing at a story I didn't hear. Completely at home in the aftermath she had created. Harrison sat beside her. Not stiff, not conflicted, just present. That detail stayed with me. Because neutrality, in moments like this, isn't neutral at all. Eleanor remained standing for a beat too long before sitting. She smoothed her dress, aligned her napkin, performed composure with a discipline that bordered on exhaustion. I remember thinking how much energy it takes to remain graceful when someone is actively trying to unmake you, and I remember reframing it for myself. This wasn't resilience, this was survival. From my vantage point, I noticed the micro shifts others missed. A guest leaned in toward another and whispered, a cousin glanced at Eleanor, then quickly looked away. The staff hesitated before approaching her, as if unsure whose authority mattered now. Power had subtly changed hands, and everyone felt it without naming it. Margaret resumed, not loudly, not theatrically. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she leaned into conversationized cruelty. Comments about Eleanor's background, questions framed as concern, observations presented as facts. Each one landed like a small stone added to an already uneven scale. At what point does wait become unbearable? Eleanor responded less now. Shorter answers. Nods instead of explanations. She wasn't retreating, she was conserving. And here's something I wish more people understood. Silence isn't weakness when it's chosen. Sometimes it's the last boundary left. Harrison excused himself briefly, returning with a drink he didn't seem to need. He touched Eleanor's shoulder once, fleetingly, like a gesture rehearsed for optics rather than comfort. She didn't lean into it. That absence spoke louder than any argument could have. How many times can someone ask, without words, "Are you with me?" before the lack of an answer becomes the answer? I want to reframe this for you because it matters. This wasn't about family tension or difficult personalities. This was about hierarchy, about who was allowed to define reality in that room. And Eleanor was losing that right by the minute. The comments escalated again, this time closer to accusation than critique. Margaret referenced concerns she'd had for a long time, hinted at conversations that had happened privately. Eleanor's eyes lifted then, sharp, alert. She knew what was coming. When someone threatens to weaponize intimacy, the damage is never accidental. Guests were listening now. Not eavesdropping, listening. The discomfort had crossed a threshold. It was communal. And still, no one interrupted. That silence pressed in on Eleanor from all sides, a social vacuum where support should have been. How isolating is it to be surrounded by people and still completely alone? Money hovered over every exchange like an unspoken verdict. The venue, the orchestra, the flowers that Margaret kept reminding everyone she'd handled. Financial contribution had become moral authority, and Eleanor didn't have enough currency to argue back. It was like watching someone drown while holding a glass of water they weren't allowed to drink. By the time dessert was served, Eleanor wasn't eating. She watched, listened, measured. Something inside her had shifted again, not breaking, but hardening into clarity. That's the moment I recognized. The moment when hope stops negotiating. I've seen this before, not often, but enough. When a bride realizes the wedding isn't the beginning of partnership, it's the proof of absence. And as I watched Eleanor sit there, composed, quiet, eyes steady, I knew this story wasn't moving toward reconciliation. It was moving toward a line that, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. And the question hanging over the room, unspoken but undeniable, was this: how much more would she be asked to endure before someone finally chose her? There's a specific kind of quiet that settles in right before something irreversible happens. It isn't peaceful, it's anticipatory. Like the room itself is holding its breath, waiting to see who will flinch first. I noticed it when the staff began hesitating before approaching Eleanor altogether. Plates were cleared around her, but not directly in front of her. Glasses refilled for everyone else first. It was subtle, almost polite, but unmistakable. Authority had shifted, and no one had announced it. Isn't it unsettling how quickly a person can be demoted without a single word being spoken? Margaret stood again, this time with the easy confidence of someone who knew she wouldn't be stopped. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Power, when it's secure, rarely does. She addressed a small cluster of guests at first, but her tone carried deliberate, practiced comments about values, about family standards, about the importance of knowing who you're welcoming into a legacy. Each word landed closer to Eleanor, narrowing the space around her. Eleanor remained seated, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. I watched the muscles in her jaw tighten, then release. Control, recalibrated. She wasn't frozen, she was listening. And listening in moments like this is an act of courage. Because what she was hearing wasn't just insult, it was narrative theft. Someone else was telling her story for her. I want to pause here and reframe something for you. This wasn't confrontation, this was positioning. Margaret wasn't arguing with Eleanor. She was redefining her in front of an audience. And once a crowd accepts that framing, reversing it becomes nearly impossible. Harrison stood nearby, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, eyes darting between his mother and his wife. He said Eleanor's name once, softly, like a suggestion rather than a stand. Then nothing. That nothing echoed louder than Margaret's words. How devastating is it when the person meant to anchor you becomes another spectator? The remarks sharpened. Past choices were implied. Motives questioned. Margaret referenced private conversations selectively, strategically, just enough to suggest there was more, always more. Eleanor's fingers curled slightly against the fabric of her dress. The lace crumpled under the pressure. A tiny tear of texture in an otherwise perfect garment. That detail stayed with me. Even the strongest materials have limits. Guests were fully engaged now. Some leaned forward, others stiffened, discomfort written plainly across their faces, but no one intervened. Social rules held them hostage. No one wants to be the one who disrupts a family matter, even when that matter becomes public cruelty. Isn't that how harm survives, by being mislabeled as private? Money, again, threaded through it all. Margaret referenced sacrifices, investments, everything she had put into making this day happen. The implication was clear. Eleanor owed obedience in exchange for luxury, like a ledger where love was measured in receipts. And in that accounting, Eleanor was always going to be in debt. I watched Eleanor lift her gaze and meet Margaret's eyes for the first time in what felt like hours. There was no anger there, no pleading, just assessment. The kind someone makes when they finally understand the terrain they're standing on. She glanced at Harrison next, waited. He didn't move, didn't speak. That was the moment. Not loud, not dramatic, but final. Here's the truth most people miss. The deepest betrayal isn't the attack. It's the permission. And Eleanor had just received confirmation that the permission was permanent. When Margaret said, clearly, calmly, that Eleanor wasn't truly worthy of her son, the room didn't erupt. It calcified. Eleanor inhaled slowly, deliberately, as if anchoring herself in her own body. She wasn't reacting. She was concluding. I remember thinking how strange it is that clarity can arrive in such an ugly package. How humiliation, when complete, leaves no room for confusion. Eleanor understood then that this marriage wasn't going to evolve into safety. It was already structured around exposure and control. And as I watched her sit there, composed but unmistakably alone, I knew we had crossed the first true point of no return. Not legally, emotionally, the kind that doesn't reverse, no matter what apologies come later. The unspoken question now hung over everyone present, heavy, unavoidable. If this is what she's willing to endure on her wedding day, what would the rest of her life look like? What changes after humiliation becomes public isn't volume, it's permission. Once the line is crossed, people stop wondering if it's appropriate and start watching how far it will go. I felt it when conversations no longer pretended not to hear. Guests stopped turning away. They turned toward the tension instead. Forks paused midair, smiles froze where they were, uncertain whether to retreat or perform politeness harder. The reception was still elegant, still moving forward on schedule, but emotionally, it had tipped into something else entirely. Isn't that the most disturbing part? How cruelty can coexist so neatly with ceremony? Margaret leaned fully into her role now, not as a concerned mother. As a moral authority, she spoke with the confidence of someone certain the room belonged to her. Her words weren't sharp anymore, they were declarative. Statements about character, about reputation, about what kind of woman fits into a family like theirs. Eleanor wasn't being criticized, she was being evaluated. Publicly, formally. Eleanor's face remained composed, but her eyes changed. They stopped scanning the room, stopped searching, they settled inward, like someone quietly closing the blinds. That's another reframe I want to offer you. When someone stops asking to be understood, it's not resignation, it's preparation. Harrison shifted closer to his mother, almost unconsciously. His body answered the question, his mouth refused to. He didn't correct her, didn't interrupt, didn't say Eleanor's name again. And in that silence, the hierarchy became undeniable. How often do people think loyalty is neutral until it costs someone else everything? Margaret's comments reached backward now, into Eleanor's past. Not specifics, insinuations, enough to stain without proving anything. Enough to make Eleanor feel watched, judged, reassembled into something smaller. Guests exchanged looks. Some nodded, others looked away. Social gravity pulled them toward Margaret. Because power attracts alignment, it always has. Money surfaced again, heavier this time. References to influence, to expectations attached to generosity. The message was unmistakable. This marriage was conditional, and Eleanor had already failed the test. Financial imbalance sat between them like a tilted floor, no matter how still Eleanor stood. She was always sliding downward. I watched Eleanor breathe through it. Slow, controlled, each inhale measured. Her hands rested calmly on the table, but I noticed the tension in her wrists. The slight tremor she refused to let reach her fingers. Emotional regulation isn't absence of feeling, it's mastery under pressure. And pressure was being applied deliberately now. Here's something else worth reframing. This wasn't about Eleanor proving her worth. That conversation had ended before it began. This was about Margaret asserting dominance in front of witnesses. Because control exercised privately can be denied. Control exercised publicly becomes history. When Margaret suggested, not joking, not hedging, that Eleanor didn't truly belong in the Hawthorne family, a murmur rippled through the room. Not outrage, recognition. People understood the stakes now. This wasn't conflict, it was exclusion. Eleanor looked at Harrison again, held his gaze longer this time, waiting, allowing space for intervention. He swallowed, looked down, said nothing. That moment was louder than any accusation Margaret had made. It answered every remaining question Eleanor hadn't wanted to ask. I could see it then, the final emotional microshift, the letting go, not of anger, but of hope. And hope, once released, doesn't claw its way back. The reception continued, but the marriage, the emotional one, had reached its breaking point. Eleanor wasn't confused anymore. She wasn't overwhelmed. She was lucid. And lucidity, in situations like this, is dangerous to people who rely on your silence. As the music played on and servers cleared plates, the future narrowed to a single, unavoidable truth. This wasn't going to stop. Not tonight. Not ever. And the question Eleanor now faced wasn't how to survive the moment. It was whether she would allow this moment to define the rest of her life. By the time Margaret spoke again, the room had already accepted her authority. That's the part people don't like to admit. Cruelty doesn't succeed because it's loud, but because it's allowed to finish its sentences. She didn't raise a glass. She didn't formally announce herself. She simply spoke, knowing she had an audience now. Her voice was steady, almost conversational, as if she were sharing an observation everyone else had been too polite to articulate. She talked about concern, about pressure, about how some relationships begin under circumstances that aren't. Entirely honest, isn't it chilling how suspicion can sound like wisdom when delivered confidently enough? Eleanor's body reacted before her face did. A slight intake of breath. Her shoulders drew back instinctively, like someone bracing for cold water. I've watched hundreds of brides navigate stress, but this was different. This wasn't nerves, this was recognition. She knew Margaret had crossed from implication into accusation. Margaret referenced private conversations then, not details not yet, but the existence of them. She suggested that Eleanor had pushed, persuaded, insisted, that Harrison had felt overwhelmed, that the wedding itself was less a celebration than a concession. Each word repositioned Eleanor from partner to aggressor, from bride to suspect. I want to reframe this clearly for you. When someone uses your vulnerability as evidence against you, they are no longer seeking resolution. They are seeking erasure. The guests didn't interrupt. Some leaned in. Others stiffened in their seats, faces tight with discomfort they didn't know how to resolve. Social etiquette became a cage. No one wanted to be the first to break it, even as it trapped Eleanor inside a narrative she hadn't consented to. How often does politeness become complicity? Harrison stood motionless. His jaw tightened once, briefly, as if he might speak. He didn't. And in that silence, something irrevocable settled over Eleanor. She wasn't being misunderstood. She was being sacrificed for peace. Money hovered in the subtext again, always there, always heavy. Margaret mentioned everything she had done to support this union. The implication was unmistakable. Support could be withdrawn. Love could be revoked. Eleanor's position in the room felt suddenly provisional, like a guest whose invitation was under review. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. Her stillness created a vacuum. Margaret rushed to fill, elaborating, clarifying, reinforcing. That urgency betrayed the truth. This wasn't spontaneous. It was rehearsed. Control always is. When Margaret finally said it plainly, that Eleanor wasn't truly worthy of her son, the words landed with a dull finality. No gasp followed. No dramatic reaction. Just a collective stillness, as if the room itself had decided to bear witness. Eleanor's expression didn't crumble. It simplified. Her eyes lost their sheen, not from tears, but from resolve. I've seen that look before. It's the moment someone realizes the past no longer needs defending because the future has already been decided. She glanced once more at Harrison, held the look, gave him time. He looked away. That was the first true rupture. Not the accusation, not the insult, the confirmation. Because in that moment, Eleanor understood something devastatingly clear. This marriage wasn't failing because of conflict. It was failing because of alignment, and she wasn't part of it. As the music resumed and servers moved again, the reception pretended nothing had changed. But Eleanor knew better. So did I. There was no path back to dignity inside that room, only forward or out. And the question now wasn't whether something irreversible had happened. It was how long Eleanor would remain in a space that had just declared her expendable. There's a moment. I've learned to recognize the instant when someone stops hoping the situation will change and starts understanding that they must. It's not dramatic. It's quiet, almost peaceful. And it happened to Eleanor while the room kept pretending everything was fine. The staff cleared dessert plates. Coffee was poured. The orchestra transitioned into something softer, smoother, like a balm applied to late. The reception settled into a rhythm that suggested continuity, normalcy, the illusion that the worst had passed. But for Eleanor, the danger wasn't escalating anymore. It had stabilized, and that was worse. She sat there, no longer reacting, no longer flinching. Her body was present, but emotionally, she had stepped back far enough to see the full shape of what she was inside. And what she saw wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a system. One with rules she hadn't written and would never be allowed to rewrite. I want to reframe this carefully, because it matters. The breaking point isn't always when someone is hurt. It's when they realize the hurt is sustainable, that it will be tolerated, normalized, repeated. That's when endurance stops being a virtue and starts becoming of erasure. Margaret looked satisfied now, relaxed. She spoke easily again, as if the earlier comments had simply been part of the evening's entertainment. That ease was its own confession. There was no fear of consequences, no concern about boundaries. Why would there be, when none had been enforced? Harrison remained where he was, close to his mother, physically aligned, emotionally absent. He didn't approach Eleanor, didn't check on her, didn't attempt repair. His silence had settled into something permanent, like wet cement hardening. How long can someone wait to be chosen before realizing the choice has already been made? Eleanor noticed what I noticed. The absence of allies. The absence of intervention. Even the guests who seemed uncomfortable hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't offered so much as a glance of reassurance. Social comfort had outweighed moral instinct, and Eleanor was paying the price for it. Money, again, pressed in from every direction. The opulence of the room now felt oppressive, like a beautiful cage. Every crystal glass, every floral arrangement funded by expectations she could never meet. Wealth had created the stage for her humiliation and demanded gratitude in return. It was imbalance dressed as generosity. Eleanor folded her napkin carefully and placed it on the table. That small gesture carried more intention than anything said aloud. She wasn't dissociating, she was organizing. When someone begins to move with deliberateness after prolonged restraint, it's not weakness, it's decision forming. I watched her look around the room one last time, not scanning for threats, not seeking validation, just observing, taking inventory. The truth was complete now. There would be no apology that mattered. No intervention that erased what had already been allowed. No future where this dynamic didn't repeat itself. The emotional point of no return had been reached. Not because of Margaret's cruelty, but because of Harrison's omission. Eleanor understood that if she stayed, she would be expected to absorb this forever. And she also understood something else, something most people only realize years later. Leaving early is not failure, it's foresight. The reception continued. Laughter resurfaced at the edges. The illusion held for everyone else. But Eleanor was already somewhere else entirely, standing at the threshold between endurance and self-respect. And as I watched her sit there, composed and utterly alone, I knew the next phase wouldn't be about confrontation anymore. It would be about choice. The shift into the next phase didn't come with a pause. There was no emotional intermission, no graceful reset. The room simply kept moving, dragging Eleanor with it, or at least trying to. Guests were fully aware now. That awareness changed the temperature of everything. Conversations no longer pretended ignorance. People spoke in fragments, half sentences, coded glances. Everyone knew something was wrong, and no one knew who was supposed to stop it. Isn't that how collective cruelty works, when responsibility dissolves into the crowd? Margaret seemed energized by the attention. She moved through the space with ease, glass in hand, greeting guests as though she were the bride herself. Her comfort was unmistakable. She wasn't bracing for backlash. She was enjoying ownership. Power, once confirmed, tends to relax its shoulders. Eleanor, by contrast, had become emotionally isolated in plain sight. She remained at the table, posture immaculate, expression neutral, but the absence around her was palpable. Chairs beside her stayed empty, longer than necessary. Conversations bent away from her orbit. Social exclusion rarely announces itself, it just rearranges the furniture. I want to reframe something here, because it's easy to misunderstand moments like this. Eleanor wasn't staying because she didn't know what to do. She was staying because she was deciding how to do it. Leaving isn't always an impulse. Sometimes it's a calculation, one that requires absolute clarity. The music continued. The service flowed. The reception adhered to protocol so tightly it felt almost defiant, as if elegance itself could override what had already been exposed. But the contrast only sharpened the cruelty. Every polished detail became a reminder that humiliation doesn't need chaos to thrive. It can live comfortably inside order. Margaret resumed speaking again, not addressing Eleanor directly, but ensuring she could hear. Comments about truths coming out eventually, about how families sometimes have to protect their own, about sacrifices made and boundaries crossed. Each remark expanded the audience, inviting interpretation, judgment, speculation. Eleanor's private life was being converted into public currency. Guests reacted differently now. Some leaned in, openly listening, others pretended not to hear but clearly did. A few glanced toward Eleanor, curiosity overtaking discomfort. The room had crossed into spectacle. And spectacle is dangerous, because once someone becomes entertainment, empathy becomes optional. Harrison remained close to his mother. He nodded once or twice, said nothing. His silence no longer read as confusion, it read as consent. And Eleanor understood that too. How many signals does someone need before they stop translating and start believing? Money still loomed, unspoken but ever present. The scale was already tipped. Margaret's influence filled the room, reinforced by resources, reputation, and social capital Eleanor didn't possess. It was like watching someone argue uphill on a floor designed to slope against them. No matter how composed she remained, gravity wasn't on her side. Eleanor didn't respond. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defend herself. Instead, she observed carefully, completely. Her stillness had shifted from restraint to resolve. This wasn't shock anymore. It was assessment, the kind that precedes irreversible action. I've learned that when humiliation becomes normalized, the next step is escalation. Not because the aggressor grows angrier, but because they grow bolder. And as Margaret continued, comfortable, confident, unchallenged, the question no longer was if she would go further. It was when Eleanor knew it too. By the time the band transitioned into softer background music, the reception had entered a warped kind of balance. Everything continued beautifully, efficiently, while the damage spread unchecked. The contradiction was almost unbearable. How can a room stay so elegant while something inside it rots? Servers glided between tables, replacing glasses, adjusting chairs, maintaining the illusion that this was still a celebration. The choreography never faltered. But Eleanor had already been removed from the role of hostess. No one asked her permission anymore. Decisions happened around her, not with her. She had become ornamental, present, visible, powerless. Margaret behaved as though this new order was natural. She spoke freely, confidently, addressing guests with the ease of someone who knew she wouldn't be contradicted. Her tone suggested authorization, as if the room itself had appointed her spokesperson. And in a way, it had. Silence is a vote, whether people intend it to be or not. I want to pause and reframe this moment because it's often misunderstood. The most damaging violence isn't always explosive. Sometimes it's procedural. It happens when harm is folded into routine and no one bothers to interrupt it. Eleanor sat perfectly still, spine straight, hands folded again, the picture of composure. But I noticed the subtle changes, the way she no longer tracked every sound, the way her focus narrowed inward. She wasn't dissociating, she was stabilizing herself emotionally, like someone preparing to cross rough water. Margaret's comments shifted tone again. They became reflective, almost philosophical. She spoke about patterns, about choices revealing character, about how certain people bring chaos into otherwise stable families. The language was abstract enough to seem reasonable, and precise enough to be unmistakable. Eleanor was being defined without being named. Guests absorbed it. Some nodded, others looked uncomfortable, but stayed seated. A few exchanged glances that said, "This shouldn't be happening," followed immediately by, "But I'm not going to stop it." Social inertia is powerful. It keeps people frozen long after they know better. Harrison remained where he was. He didn't reposition himself. Didn't close the physical distance between Eleanor and his mother. His body had chosen sides even if his words never would. That choice hung in the air like a verdict Eleanor had already read. Money surfaced again, subtly woven into Margaret's narrative. References to responsibility, to investment, to expectations that come with support. Eleanor's presence in the room felt increasingly conditional, as if her legitimacy was being audited in real time. Financial leverage doesn't need to threaten, it just needs to exist. Eleanor took a slow breath and released it carefully. That breath mattered. It was the first outward sign that something inside her had locked into place. She wasn't absorbing anymore, she was concluding. And conclusion is dangerous to people who rely on endurance. Here's another reframe worth holding on to. Staying silent doesn't always mean accepting the narrative. Sometimes it means refusing to engage with it on its own terms. Eleanor wasn't defending herself because she no longer believed this space deserved explanation. The reception continued, distorted but functional. Laughter surfaced at other tables, a little too loud, a little too forced. Normalcy had become performance. And Eleanor, still seated in her wedding dress, had never felt further from the role she was supposed to play. The balance of the evening had shifted permanently. This wasn't a prelude to reconciliation. It was the normalization of humiliation. And once harm becomes routine, the only thing left is escalation. Margaret was comfortable. Harrison was silent. The room was complicit, and Eleanor was almost ready. Margaret didn't raise her voice when she finally crossed the line. She lowered it. That was how I knew it was intentional. She leaned closer to the group around her, just enough to make it feel intimate, just enough to guarantee it would still travel. And then she began to reference things Eleanor had said, not tonight, not publicly, but privately. Conversations meant for trust, reshaped into evidence. Confessions stripped of context. Vulnerabilities reframed as strategy. Isn't that the most violating part, when something offered in confidence is returned as a weapon? Eleanor's head lifted slightly, not in surprise, in recognition. She had known this was coming. I could see it in the way her eyes sharpened, the way her attention snapped fully back into the room. This was no longer background harm. This was direct exposure. Margaret spoke about Eleanor's past as if it were a cautionary tale. She questioned her intentions without ever using the word, suggested motives without naming them. The effect was devastatingly precise. Guests didn't need details to draw conclusions. Ambiguity did the work for her. I want to reframe this moment clearly. This wasn't about truth. Truth doesn't need an audience. This was about narrative control, about deciding who Eleanor would be remembered as, right there in that room. The reactions came quickly. A sharp inhale from one table, a whisper at another. Curiosity edged out discomfort. Eleanor had become a subject of discussion instead of a person. And once that happens, dignity becomes optional. Harrison stood frozen. He looked at his mother, then at Eleanor. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. Whatever thought passed through him never became action. Silence again filled the space where protection should have been. How many chances does someone get before inaction becomes character? Money loomed heavier now, like gravity increasing without warning. Margaret alluded to sacrifices she'd made, risks she'd taken, influence she'd leveraged. The implication was unmistakable. Eleanor's presence in this marriage was conditional, and the conditions were being revoked publicly. Financial power doesn't need to shout, it just needs witnesses. Eleanor didn't interrupt. She didn't cry. She didn't defend herself. She sat still, absorbing the full scope of what was happening. That stillness wasn't weakness. It was clarity crystallizing. She wasn't deciding whether to respond. She was deciding whether this marriage deserved her voice at all. Guests looked to Harrison now, waiting, expecting. The pause stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. He didn't move, didn't speak. That hesitation sealed what Margaret's words had begun. The attack had become institutional, endorsed by omission. Here's the truth most people don't want to face: when humiliation is public and unanswered, it rewrites the relationship permanently. Eleanor understood that. I could see it in the way she finally exhaled, slowly, deliberately, like someone releasing a weight they'd been carrying for too long. Margaret finished her point with a calm finality, as though she'd simply clarified a misunderstanding. The room didn't challenge her. Why would it? Power had already announced itself. Eleanor remained seated, but something essential had shifted. She was no longer the target hoping for reprieve. She was an observer, reaching conclusion, and as the murmurs continued around her, the unspoken questions settled heavily into the space between them all. After this, what exactly was left to save? Once the private became public, there was no pretense left to maintain. The room didn't soften, it sharpened. Margaret straightened her posture, as if preparing to deliver a conclusion rather than an opinion. Her voice carried farther now, not louder, just more assured. She stopped circling implications and finally named the structure beneath them. She said the marriage had never truly been right, that it had moved too fast, that Harrison had been pressured, that love, real love, doesn't need convincing. Each sentence dismantled the union piece by piece, calmly, methodically, like someone unfastening bolts they'd always intended to remove. Eleanor listened without moving. I watched the muscles in her neck tighten, then relax. She wasn't shocked anymore. Shock had passed earlier. This was something colder comprehension. When someone tells you your marriage is illegitimate in front of witnesses, they aren't just attacking you, they're erasing your status in real time. I want to reframe this moment for you because it's crucial. This wasn't about disagreement over compatibility. This was a public invalidation of consent. Margaret wasn't questioning the relationship, she was revoking it. Guests reacted audibly now. A few gasps, some murmurs that didn't bother to stay quiet. The social contract had broken. The reception was no longer a celebration, it was a tribunal. And Eleanor was seated at the center of it, dressed for joy, on trial for wanting it. Margaret's language turned institutional. She spoke about the family, about legacy, about what could and could not be accepted. She positioned herself not as a mother with feelings, but as a gatekeeper with authority. And Harrison stood beside her, silent, visible, aligned. That alignment mattered more than any words he could have spoken. His presence reinforced her message. His silence legitimized it. How many times can someone refuse to intervene before their refusal becomes the loudest statement in the room? Money surfaced again, unmistakably now. Margaret referenced responsibility, contribution, sacrifice, all the ways she had supported this wedding. The implication settled heavily over Eleanor. This marriage existed on borrowed approval, and the loan was being called in front of everyone. Eleanor's gaze lifted slowly, deliberately, and met Harrison's. She didn't plead, she didn't accuse, she waited. The room waited with her. It was the kind of pause that forces truth to choose a side. Harrison said nothing. That silence was the final fracture. Not loud, not dramatic, but complete. I saw Eleanor's face change then, not with pain, but with decision. Something released, the last illusion fell away. She wasn't being abandoned impulsively. She was being shown, with brutal clarity, that this marriage had no defender. Margaret finished by saying she would never accept this union. Not now, not later, not quietly. The statement hung in the air, like a verdict already signed. The reception had reached its moral breaking point. The marriage had been publicly stripped of legitimacy, and Eleanor understood something essential in that moment. Whatever happened next, staying silent would no longer protect her. The choice had been forced, and Eleanor was about to make it. Margaret didn't hesitate after that. Once legitimacy had been stripped away, she moved to claim what was left. She turned toward Harrison fully now, no longer addressing the room, but knowing the room was listening. Her voice softened in a way that felt almost intimate, almost maternal, a calculated contrast to what she'd just done. She said his name slowly, deliberately, as if grounding him back into something familiar. Then she told him it was time to be honest, time to choose. The words landed heavier than any accusation before them. Not because they were loud, but because they were final. She framed it as necessity, not cruelty. Family or marriage. Blood or mistake. There was no middle ground offered. No grace period. Isn't that how control works? By pretending there were only two doors and locking one of them? The room went completely still. Even the music faltered for a moment before resuming, unsure of its role. Servers froze mid-step. Conversations evaporated. Everyone felt it. This wasn't conflict anymore. This was a demand. Eleanor didn't move. She didn't look at Margaret. She kept her eyes on Harrison, waiting, giving him the full dignity of a choice. Even now, that mattered. Because in that pause, she was still offering partnership, not pleading for it, but allowing it to exist if he chose it. I want to reframe this moment carefully. This wasn't about loyalty. Loyalty can coexist with boundaries. This was about submission. And the cost of refusing it was being made very clear. Harrison swallowed. His hands clenched at his sides. He looked at his mother, then at Eleanor, then back at his mother again. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but decisive. His body answered before his words could. He didn't step forward, didn't close the space between himself and Eleanor. He stayed exactly where he was. Seconds stretched. Each one felt deliberate. The room waited for him to speak, to interrupt, to push back, to say enough. He didn't. Silence filled the space where commitment should have been. And silence, in moments like this, isn't absence, it's alignment. Eleanor's expression didn't change immediately, but something inside her settled, like a final piece clicking into place. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't devastated in the way people expect. She was confirmed. That quiet confirmation carried more weight than grief ever could. Money hung over the moment like an invisible contract. The power imbalance was complete now, social, emotional, financial. Eleanor had nothing left to leverage, and she knew it. But leverage isn't the same as dignity, and dignity doesn't require permission. Margaret watched Harrison carefully, then nodded once, satisfied. The demand had worked, or so she thought. Control believes victory is immediate. It rarely sees the long consequences forming. The room exhaled slowly, awkwardly. Some guests shifted in their seats. Others looked down at their plates. No one applauded, no one spoke. The choice had been made without words, and everyone understood it. Eleanor finally looked away from Harrison. That, more than anything else, told me this stage was over. The waiting had ended. The offering had been withdrawn. The question that had hovered all night had been answered not by words, but by omission. And with that answer, Eleanor's decision was no longer hypothetical. It was inevitable. What happens after a choice is made without words is rarely loud. It settles, it spreads. It becomes real in the smallest details. Eleanor didn't react immediately. She didn't stand. She didn't speak. She simply sat there, eyes forward, as if she were letting the reality of Harrison's silence finish arriving. That pause wasn't hesitation. It was confirmation. When someone shows you who they are under pressure, believing them is an act of self-respect. The room shifted again. Not toward drama, toward discomfort. Guests avoided Eleanor's gaze now, not because they agreed with what had happened, but because acknowledging her would mean acknowledging their own complicity. Isn't that one of the cruelest parts of public humiliation, how it isolates you even further after it's complete? Margaret relaxed into her chair. Victory assumed. She adjusted her glass, smoothed the fabric of her dress, already moving past the moment she had engineered. For her, the demand had been the climax. The outcome felt settled. Control likes to believe silence equals surrender. Harrison remained standing near her, shoulders slightly hunched now, as if the weight of what he hadn't done was finally pressing down. But still, no movement toward Eleanor, no whispered apology, no attempt at repair. Omission had become posture. I want to reframe this clearly because it's where many people misunderstand what comes next. Eleanor wasn't staying because she was trapped. She was staying because she was choosing the timing of her exit. There's power in deciding when the door closes. Money still filled the space, but its meaning had changed. The opulence no longer felt intimidating, it felt irrelevant. The chandeliers, the flowers, the carefully curated luxury all seemed oddly fragile now, like scenery built for a story that had already ended. When respect is gone, extravagance becomes hollow. Eleanor's breathing slowed. Her hands, which had been folded so carefully all evening, relaxed. That physical release was subtle but telling. She wasn't bracing anymore. She was resolved. The emotional labor was over. She looked once more around the room, not searching for allies, not gauging reaction, just observing the truth laid bare. This was the future being offered to her, one where her dignity would always be negotiable and her silence expected. And she knew, with complete certainty, that accepting that future would cost more than leaving ever could. The reception continued on the surface. Music played. Glasses clinked again, tentatively. People tried to recover the evening, but recovery was impossible. The rupture had already redefined the event. This wedding would never be remembered for its beauty. It would be remembered for its fracture. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair. That movement alone reset the room's attention. Chairs stilled. Conversations stopped again. Control shifted just slightly back toward her. Not because she demanded it, but because decision commands attention. She didn't speak yet. She didn't need to. Her posture was enough. Calm, upright, finished with endurance. I remember thinking, as I watched her stand there in her wedding dress, surrounded by everything she was about to walk away from. This wasn't collapse, this was preparation. The silence after Eleanor stood was unlike anything I'd heard in a reception hall before. It wasn't shock. It wasn't anticipation. It was uncertainty. The kind that settles when people realize the scripts they were following no longer applies. She remained still for a moment, hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture calm in a way that felt deliberate. The dress caught the light as she moved, the fabric whispering softly against the floor. Every eye was on her now. Margaret stopped mid-motion, glass hovering near her lips. Harrison finally turned fully toward Eleanor, as if only now registering that something had shifted. Had he expected her to sit back down? To absorb it quietly, like everything else? I want to reframe this moment for you, because it's easy to misread it. This wasn't Eleanor preparing to react emotionally. This was Eleanor reclaiming authorship. There's a difference between responding to harm and ending the conversation entirely. The room waited. No one interrupted her. No one dared. Even the music faded into the background, reduced to an afterthought. Eleanor's calm carried more authority than Margaret's certainty ever had. Power had changed hands, not through confrontation, but through finality. She glanced briefly at the guests, not scanning for approval, not gauging sympathy, just acknowledging the witnesses. Then her gaze returned to Harrison. He looked unsettled now, his confidence eroded by the reality of consequence. Isn't it strange how silence feels safe until it's exposed under light? Margaret's expression tightened. She sensed the shift, even if she didn't yet understand it. Control hates uncertainty. It relies on predictability, on knowing how far it can push, and Eleanor had just stepped outside the range Margaret had planned for. The opulence of the room suddenly felt suspended, like scenery waiting to be struck. Crystal, flowers, linen, all of it seemed irrelevant compared to the clarity standing at the center of the floor. Money couldn't interrupt this moment. Status couldn't soften it. Nothing could redirect it. Eleanor took a slow breath. Not to steady herself, she was already steady, but to mark the moment. A line was being drawn, not in anger, but in certainty. How often do we mistake quiet for weakness, only to realize too late that it was restraint all along? I watched Margaret shift in her seat, preparing to speak to reassert control. But Eleanor didn't give her the opening. She didn't rush. She didn't escalate. She simply stood there, holding the room without saying a word. And in that stillness, she made it clear, whatever came next would be on her terms. This wasn't the beginning of an argument. It was the beginning of an ending. For a brief moment, the reception tried to hold on to its last illusion. A waiter hovered uncertainly near the edge of the room, tray in hand, unsure whether to move forward or retreat. The band members exchanged glances, fingers still resting on strings, waiting for a cue that would never come. The protocol was still there, technically intact, but hollow, like a house after the furniture has been removed. Isn't that what happens when meaning leaves before structure does? Eleanor remained standing, composed, eyes forward. She didn't rush into speech. She let the silence stretch, not as punishment, but as confirmation. Silence, used deliberately, forces people to confront what they've already allowed. And everyone in that room had allowed this. Harrison took a tentative step toward her, then stopped. The hesitation was almost painful to watch. Too late, his instincts finally stirred. But they had nowhere to land. Repair requires timing, and timing had been squandered. How many chances does someone get before urgency turns into regret? Margaret, sensing the loss of control, straightened again, her fingers tightened around her glass. She opened her mouth as if to redirect the moment to explain, to justify, to reclaim narrative authority. But Eleanor didn't look at her. That omission was intentional. By refusing eye contact, Eleanor removed Margaret from the center of the story entirely. I want to reframe this clearly for you. Ignoring someone in moments like this isn't avoidance. It's boundary. Eleanor wasn't engaging because engagement would have granted relevance, and relevance was no longer owed. The guests shifted in their seats, discomfort rippling outward. Some looked at Eleanor with dawning understanding. Others looked down, embarrassed by their earlier stillness. The social atmosphere had inverted. The silence that once protected Margaret now exposed everyone else. Eleanor inhaled slowly. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise. It carried because it didn't need to convince anyone. She wasn't explaining, she was stating. She said she had listened. She said she had waited. She said she now understood exactly where she stood. Each sentence landed cleanly, without embellishment. There was no bitterness in her tone, only clarity. And clarity, in moments like this, is devastating. Money, status, spectacle, all of it collapsed under the weight of her calm. The imbalance that had ruled the room suddenly looked absurd. What good is leverage when the person you're trying to control no longer wants what you're offering? Harrison's face tightened as her words reached him. He tried to speak once, softly, but Eleanor continued, not over him, past him. She wasn't debating, she was concluding, and conclusion doesn't pause for interruption. Margaret sat rigid now, her earlier confidence draining into something sharper, more brittle. Control, once lost, doesn't fade gracefully. It cracks. And Eleanor had just found the fault line. As she spoke, I realized this wasn't a speech. It was a closing statement. Not for the room, for herself. The final confirmation that endurance had ended and choice had begun. And the room understood something then, collectively and uncomfortably. Whatever Eleanor said next would not be negotiable. Eleanor paused after her last sentence, not because she was uncertain, but because she was checking something inside herself. I recognized that pause. It's the moment someone confirms that what they're about to do isn't driven by emotion, it's driven by truth. She looked at Harrison then. Really looked at him. Not with anger. Not with disappointment. With understanding. The kind that arrives when you finally stop hoping someone will become who you need them to be. How heavy is that realization, to accept someone exactly as they've shown themselves to you? Harrison opened his mouth again, this time more urgently. He reached for her hand, fingers brushing the edge of her sleeve. Eleanor stepped back just enough to break contact. The gesture was small, almost polite, but final. She didn't need distance to hurt him. She needed it to stay clear. Margaret shifted sharply in her chair, preparing to intervene, to reassert control, but Eleanor didn't look at her, not once. By now it was evident. This wasn't a confrontation between women. This was a reckoning with absence, the absence of partnership, of protection, of boundaries. I want to reframe this moment, because many people mistake what comes next as impulsive. It wasn't. Eleanor had been deciding all evening. The humiliation didn't push her to act. The clarity did. She spoke again, calmly, firmly, each word measured. She said that what had just happened wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a preview. She said she could live through discomfort, but not through disrespect, without limits. The room listened, truly listened, because her tone made it impossible to dismiss her as emotional. Money, power, family, all the forces that had been used to corner her suddenly felt irrelevant. Eleanor had stepped outside their reach. When someone no longer seeks approval, leverage loses its grip. It's like trying to pull a rope that's already been cut. Harrison's face fell as her meaning became unmistakable. This wasn't a request. This wasn't an ultimatum. This was a conclusion delivered with restraint. He tried to speak again, voice barely audible, but Eleanor shook her head once. A simple motion. Enough. The guests were utterly silent now, no whispers, no shifting. The spectacle had transformed into something solemn. People weren't watching drama anymore. They were witnessing a decision. Eleanor said that a marriage without protection isn't a partnership, it's exposure. And she said she had no intention of building a life inside that dynamic. Not quietly, not patiently, not at all. Margaret finally spoke then, sharp and defensive, trying to reframe, to minimize, to regain control. But Eleanor didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had already moved past engagement. Responding would have meant reopening a door she had just closed. I could see it in Margaret's face, the sudden realization that authority had limits when the other person simply leaves the field. Control can dominate a room, but it can't follow someone who walks away. Eleanor took one last breath, steady and unshaken. The truth had fully landed for her and for everyone else. The only thing left now was to make it irreversible. Eleanor stepped forward then, not toward Harrison, not toward Margaret, but into the center of the space that had tried to swallow her. The movement was deliberate, unhurried. Her dress brushed softly against the floor, the sound barely audible, yet it reset the entire room's attention. When someone claims the center without asking permission, everyone feels it. She spoke clearly now, not raised, not softened, just precise. She said the words people rarely expect to hear at a wedding reception. She said that what had just unfolded made something unmistakably clear, that a marriage cannot exist where respect is conditional. That partnership cannot survive where silence replaces protection. Each sentence felt like a door closing gently, but firmly behind her. I want to reframe this moment because it's often misunderstood. This wasn't Eleanor destroying a wedding. The wedding had already been dismantled. She was simply naming what was already broken. There is a profound difference between ending something and acknowledging its end. The room didn't gasp, it didn't erupt, it absorbed. The weight of her calm pressed against every polished surface, every carefully curated detail. Money, spectacle, tradition, none of it could interrupt the truth being spoken. Financial power had tried to dictate the terms of her belonging. But belonging, Eleanor made clear, was no longer something she was willing to negotiate. She said she was ending the marriage, not later, not privately. Now, right there, during the reception, the timing wasn't cruel, it was accurate. The marriage had been publicly undone, and so it would be publicly concluded. Dignity demanded symmetry. Harrison took a step forward, panic finally breaking through his restraint. He said her name louder this time. Eleanor didn't turn. That was the moment he understood something irreversible had already happened. The silence he'd chosen earlier had reached its consequence. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She protested, objected, tried to reassert control with words that sounded suddenly hollow. Authority, once challenged by certainty, loses its shape. Eleanor didn't argue, she didn't explain, she didn't justify. Justification is a conversation, and this one was over. The guests sat frozen, caught between shock and recognition. Some looked relieved, others uncomfortable, all of them aware they were witnessing something they would remember for the rest of their lives. This wasn't scandal, it was boundary setting on a scale people rarely see. Eleanor said the reception was over, not angrily, not dramatically, simply as a fact. Like announcing the end of a performance whose meaning had already expired. The words landed with finality. Staff paused, unsure, then slowly began to move. The machinery of the event responded to her authority at last. As she turned to leave, I noticed her shoulders relax for the first time all evening. The tension that had held her upright dissolved into something quieter, relief. Leaving wasn't collapse, it was release. I watched her walk away alone, through a room that no longer had any power over her. The chandeliers still glittered. The flowers remained perfect, but none of it mattered anymore. The marriage had ended in the same place it had been undone, in public, with clarity and without apology. For a moment after Eleanor walked away, no one moved. Not immediately. It was as if the room needed time to understand that the center it had revolved around all evening was gone. Margaret stood rigid, hands clenched at her sides, her authority suddenly exposed as situational rather than absolute. Power depends on participation, and Eleanor had withdrawn hers completely. Without resistance to push against, control collapses inward. Isn't it striking how quickly dominance looks like desperation once it loses its audience? Harrison remained where he was, staring after Eleanor as if the distance between them had expanded far beyond the length of the ballroom. His posture sagged, shoulders rounded, the confidence he'd borrowed from silence finally spent. He tried to speak to someone, I don't know who, but the words didn't land. There was no one left to convince. Guests began to stir, slowly at first. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Murmurs returned, but they were different now, subdued, reflective. This wasn't gossip being born, it was reckoning. People understood they had just witnessed a boundary enforced at its breaking point. The staff moved cautiously, unsure whose instructions still mattered. The machinery of the reception had been designed for celebration, not rupture. Flowers remained untouched. Plates sat half full. The luxury felt suddenly excessive, like a grand stage after the actors have exited. Money, once used as leverage, now looked absurd in its abundance. What good is extravagance when the person it was meant to impress has already left? I want to reframe this moment, because endings like this are often mischaracterized as dramatic or destructive. What Eleanor did wasn't destruction, it was refusal. She refused to continue paying an emotional debt she never agreed to incur. Margaret tried to regain control, issuing instructions, questioning staff, attempting to contain the fallout. But containment was impossible. The rupture had already escaped the room. Social consequences don't obey hierarchy. Once something like this happens, it belongs to everyone. Harrison finally moved, pushing through a cluster of guests toward the exit Eleanor had taken, but he stopped short of the door. That hesitation was telling. He had followed too late again. And lateness, repeated enough times, becomes its own decision. The guests began to leave in small groups, voices low, expressions thoughtful. Some avoided eye contact with Margaret, others nodded politely, unsure what etiquette applied anymore. The event had lost its rules. When structure collapses, people rely on instinct, and instinct was telling them to go. As the room emptied, the weight of what had occurred settled fully into place. The marriage hadn't ended because of one sentence or one moment. It ended because protection never arrived. Eleanor's departure hadn't been impulsive. It had been precise. I stood there, watching the aftermath, feeling the familiar mix of sorrow and respect that comes when someone chooses themselves publicly. It isn't comfortable to witness, but it is honest. And honesty, once spoken out loud, has a way of clearing rooms. By the time the ballroom was nearly empty, the meaning of what had happened had fully settled. Not as scandal, not as shock, but as consequence. The chandeliers still glowed overhead, reflecting off untouched glassware and immaculate table settings, but the light felt colder now, decorative, not celebratory. The space looked the same, yet everything about it had changed. That's what happens when the truth exits before the guests do. The room keeps its shape, but loses its purpose. Eleanor was gone, not rushed, not chased. She had left on her own terms, and that mattered. There had been no collapse, no pleading, no spectacle beyond what had already been forced upon her. Her departure had been clean, intentional, final. Margaret sat alone at one of the long tables now, her earlier certainty replaced by rigidity. Control had nowhere left to go. Without Eleanor to dominate, the force she'd wielded all evening turned inward, brittle, and exposed. Authority built on coercion rarely survives the moment it's refused. Harrison stood near the exit, unmoving, as if the space beyond the doors might still offer reversal. But reversal requires timing, and timing had passed. He had been asked to choose in public, and had chosen silence. That silence had done its work. I want to reframe the ending because stories like this are often reduced to shock value. Eleanor didn't end her marriage impulsively. She ended it logically. When respect has no advocate, leaving is not drama, it's clarity. Money had lost its weight entirely by then. The luxury of the evening now felt ornamental, almost irrelevant. Financial power had attempted to dictate belonging, but belonging can't be purchased, and dignity can't be rented. The imbalance that once tilted every interaction had evaporated the moment Eleanor withdrew her consent. As I gathered my things quietly, I thought about how rare it is to see someone choose themselves at the exact moment the cost of staying becomes visible. Most people wait years. Eleanor waited hours, not because she was impatient, but because the truth had been delivered without ambiguity. The guests who remained spoke softly, already shaping the story they would tell later. Some would call it shocking, others would call it tragic, but the truest version was simpler. A woman recognized a future built on silence and refused to live inside it. Eleanor had walked out alone, yes, but she hadn't left empty-handed. She had left with her boundaries intact, her voice reclaimed, her dignity preserved. That kind of exit costs everything in the moment and saves everything that matters afterward. And if there's one question this night leaves behind, it isn't about weddings or families or wealth. It's this: how much does it cost to remain where respect has never existed? At the beginning, it all seemed too small to matter. A misplaced comment, a polite silence, a gesture that never came. In the end, that was exactly what decided everything. Not the accusation itself, but the permission behind it. What started as discomfort ended as clarity. I've learned to recognize moments like this, not when someone is attacked, but when no one moves. Because that's when the cost is quietly calculated and someone decides who will pay it. Eleanor understood before anyone else. Staying would have meant calling a place home, where silence would always speak louder than she did. Some stories don't end with noise, but with certainty, and that is enough. If this stayed with you, there are other stories here that continue this conversation, with the same attention to the moments that change everything. Stay with me, and I'll see you there.